Husky. It's a husky puppy. It's a husky puppy. Beep. Okay, so time to talk about Balto, which is kind of appropriate, semi-appropriate. So at the very least, at the time that I'm recording this, it is 2025. I'm hoping it goes up before then, which is nice and appropriate because 1925 is when the story of Balto takes place during the 1925 serum run to Nome. For the diphtheria outbreak that they had there, that the story of Balto is based on. And we're going to talk about the movie that came out in 1995, which was 30 years ago. So 2 anniversaries covered there for that. Hopefully this goes up in 2025, depending on how I have all the other videos set up for when stuff's going to go out. For how far ahead it's being recorded. So, Balto, the movie, is loosely based on the true story of the dog Balto, who was a sled dog, who helped save the children in Nome, Alaska, infected with diphtheria back in 1925. And the movie is animated, and yes, there's historical inaccuracies and differences and stuff with the movie. I'll go over a couple of those at the end of the movie, at the end of the video, after I've discussed the movie itself. But for the most part, we're going to focus on this. It's kind of similar to when I did the Pocahontas review in when I was doing all the Disney movies. How I was like, we're kind of separating the fact of like Pocahontas in the story that is the Disney version, and then mentioning a bunch of the differences for the historical inaccuracies and stuff like that, where it's like keeping the two separate. And then like learning about like, so this is what this movie shows, this is what happened in real life type of a thing. And at the very least for like Balto in comparison for the true story versus this, you know, based on a true story version of it, there's far less inaccuracies and they're far less grievous than like the differences between like real life Pocahontas and what happens in the Disney movies, the Disney movie and the sequel. So into Balto. Also, not a musical. There's one song in this. There's good like background music, but there's no songs in it except the end credit song, which we'll get to. So into Balto. So the movie starts out live action in New York City in what is supposed to be 1995. 30 years after, 70 years after the Nome, Alaska incident for the serum run. And it starts off with this old lady and her, elderly woman and her granddaughter wandering through Central Park looking for the memorial statue. And, the lady sits down because she's getting tired of walking around, which is fair. As much as I would love to go to Central Park, I would also be like, I'm going to have to sit down at various points in time because this is a lot of walking. If I ever end up in New York, I really want to go to Central Park, if I have the chance. But because like lots of movies that I love have like sequences filmed there, and I would like to just kind of go and see. But in the movie, she sits down and her granddaughter sits down next to her, and she's like, okay, so I'm going to tell you the story of the thing that we're looking for. And she goes into talking about, it was 1925 and we were in the middle of nowhere, Nome, Alaska. And then we cut into the animated sequence, which is where we cut back to that point in time. And we are introduced to the beautiful landscape of Alaska. I personally have never been to Alaska. At some point in time, I would like to visit all 50 states. 25. Haha, I don't even know if I've visited 25 states in my whole life so far. But I would love to go to Alaska. Alaska is just one of those places I would love to go to. My grandparents on my dad's side have been there. I think one of my aunt and uncle's sets at least have been there. Stuff like that, where it's like I've had family that have been there, but I just have not been there. And it looks gorgeous. And part of it is melting because of the ice caps and global warming. But what ends up happening is we're introduced to the beautiful landscape, and we are, of course, introduced to the sled dogs. that are the stars of this movie. We are first introduced to Steele and his team, and Steele is supposed to be like this purebred dog, sled dog who is very egotistical, very competitive, always has to be the best at being the best, and everything. We see him cheating to win a race, and such like that. So that's kind of how we're introduced to that. And we are also then introduced to Balto, who in the movie is a wolf dog, meaning that he's half wolf, half dog. And it's implied that his mother is the wolf and his father was like a purebred husky. And he lives on the outskirts of Nome with his kind of adopted father figure, whatever, this Russian snow goose named Boris. Where they came up with the character, I have no idea, but I find Boris hilarious throughout this whole movie. And very wise, too, because he very much loves Balto. And throughout the course of the beginning of the movie, we have Balto just very interested in like the sleigh race, the sled racing and everything else like that. But he is this outcast amongst the dogs because he's half wolf. And of course, all the citizens of Nome look at him as this, scavenger, as this thing that you can't trust because he's part wolf. Multiple times he said he might turn on you, type of a thing, which given the fact that I have a, pit bull, a lot of people are scared of pit bulls because like they have this very bad reputation, unfortunately. But my opinion of dogs is like all dogs are good boys and girls and deserve all the love in the world and deserve wonderful homes. The humans who own them and make them mean are the problem. But Brenda has a very good home, so she's not going to be a mean girl. Although she really likes to bark at bikes. And I don't know why, but she likes to bark at bikes when we're on walks. But back to the story. So there's the sled dog race going on, and we are then also introduced to this little girl named Rosie and her dog, Jenna, who is, a red husky, beautiful dog. And Rosie is very interested in like sled racing and everything else like that. And like her parents are having this sled made for her by the carpenter and everything. So, they very much encourage this, and she loves sled racing and everything else like that. And we see how much, Rosie loves Jenna and vice versa and everything. And they're there watching the race. And unfortunately, Rosie's hat gets blown away, and it's going to get trampled by, Steele and his sled team if the hat's not saved. So what ends up happening is Balto runs out, races, basically is kind of like racing Steele, gets to the hat, jumps out of the way in time, so he's not going to be crossing the finish line, and, gives the hat back to Rosie, and she's like, "Aw, all to show off for a pretty girl," type of a thing, because she's like teasing Balto. And we get introduced to, like the characters this way. And like Rosie tries to be very nice to Balto, but then her father shows up and like, pulls her away from Balto and like kicks snow at him. It's like, he's a wolf, he'll turn on you. He's part wolf, you don't know what he'll do. So this shows just how much Balto is, ostracized. Again, we'll get into the inaccuracies later. And what ends up happening is, of course, we see how arrogant Steele is, and he doesn't like the fact that Balto could technically challenge him because Balto is very fast, and Steele doesn't like that. And we also see these other female dogs in town that are Jenna's friends, and one of them is clearly very much attracted to Steele and just tries to flirt with him every chance she gets. And the other one is like this town gossip, basically. And throughout the course of, the day, Balto gets ridiculed by the other sled dogs because they come over and start, taunting him and, insulting his mother and everything else like that, who he didn't really know that well, and he probably didn't know his father all that well either. In the context of this story, we never find out if Balto has like any siblings necessarily, although it's implied maybe he doesn't. He was the only one. Don't know. But like the other dogs just ridicule him and everything, and there's like these three other dogs, Nikki, Caltag, and Star. And they're like, Steele's like backup dancers, basically, backup singers. And like, whenever Steele's around, they praise Steele. Whenever he's not around, they're just like, oh, good God, this guy is a complete jackass for just how Steele treats everybody. They don't like Steele, but they have to suck up to him if they want to stay on the team. And of course, so then they head outside of, Balto and Boris head back to this, abandoned ship that they live in. And Boris is just trying to do everything he can to try to help Balto feel better, cheer him up and everything. He's trying, chews on a bone, drinks out of the water dish, tries to have a toy, tries to dances, tries to do anything he can to try to make Balto feel better. And Balto's just kind of like, no, I don't want to. And then Boris just kind of like sighs and lays next to him. And we just have like this conversation where like Balto is like, well, why don't you ever just fly south with the rest of the geese? And Boris is just like, no, then who would stay here and take care of you? And then we are introduced to Muck and Luck, who are these two polar bears that are also kind of, outcast from the other polar bears. Because they are scared of water and they can't swim. And this obviously comes up later in the movie, but Boris is kind of like, why do I have to deal with these bears? And Muck and Luck are just like they adore Boris and Balto and everything, and like they just love being around them because they're their friends. So we see that, the introduction, and then like Balto clearly has this crush on Jenna, which is not surprising. And Balto goes into town trying to just talk to Jenna. But unfortunately, this is lining up for when Rosie is at the hospital. And it is, it's being revealed that Rosie and the other children are unfortunately very sick, that there's this epidemic of diphtheria going around. And the way that Jenna and Balto end up, learning this information is like Balto, Jenna is not really let into the hospital to find out what's going on. But what ends up happening is like Balto, because he's, so used to just like having to sneak around the town and everything else like that, he knows like all of the different entrances and everything else like that. Secret entrances and passageways and stuff like that. So he takes Jenna into like the under part of the hospital area of the doctor's office, and they're able to listen through the grate to find out that, oh, that's not good. But also while they're down there, we have this moment where Balto is showing Jenna this cool little trick where there's all these broken bottles. They're different colors, and using the light from the lantern that's in the doctor's office, he's able to make like this mini aurora borealis on the wall behind them, which Jenna finds very interesting. Very impressive. And then of course they're listening in on the fact that the doctor is explaining to Rosie's parents that like she has diphtheria. It's the whatever number of case this week, and I'm out of antitoxin, which is like their form of like a vaccine. Oh great, another thing that could come back. Fun. We don't need another serum run to Nome, Alaska. And so it's like they're all out of the diphtheria medicine, and he's like, there's nothing I can do about that right now. All the best we can do is try to make the kids comfortable and treat them to the best of our abilities, which isn't much, unfortunately. I tried looking up diphtheria, and after seeing a picture, I'm like, nope, I don't want to look at that. It's basically something that like restricts your breathing, so it makes it harder and harder for you to breathe properly, is one of the things that it does, and probably gives you like a fever and chills and different things like that, all those various symptoms that go along with various diseases. And we just had to deal with our own epidemic, the pandemic with COVID, several years ago at this point in time, so that's fun. And so Jenna's exceedingly worried about Rosie, and all the dogs are worried, and all the parents are worried, and everybody in town is worried about this. And so what ends up happening is, of course, they send for a request from Anchorage to send them the diphtheria medication, the medicine that they need. And this is, of course, what starts the setup where it's just like, okay, well, we'll try by, sea first. The sea's too dangerous and freezing over, and we can't get through, so we'll try by airplane. but the airplane, the storms are just too strong, so we can't send it by plane. We'll send it from Anchorage to Nenana, which is like the closest other town, I guess, that they would be able to get it to by train. Send the antitoxin that way, and then send a sled dog team from Nome to Nenana to get the vaccine and then take it all the way back to Nome. And these are all real events that happened. There was a diphtheria outbreak. They did, they couldn't get it to, back to Nome any other way, so they had to use the train to get it to Nenana and then the sled dog team. Now, there were multiple sled dog teams that were a part of this, which I'll get to a little bit later. But in this part in the movie, they have it be that, they have this race to see who's the sled dogs that are going to be on the team for the run, because it's like, well, the intention is to have the best team to be able to get to Nenana and back again as quick as possible with the antitoxin, so that way they are able to get the children the medication. Obviously, that's the whole point of this, because if the kids die, we lose, basically. And what ends up happening is, of course, they have this sled dog race to determine who's going to be part of it, and Balto joins the race. He runs into the race at the last second and is, we see all the dogs running, and Steele's not the one running, but all the rest of the dogs on the team are, and some of the other dogs in town are part of the race. And Balto, even with having to deal with various hazards, proves that he is the fastest. And, Steele's owner, or the musher, is kind of like, well, let's see about this. And then, Steele makes Balto, makes Balto look dangerous, and all of that. There was a scene earlier that I forgot to say where they were coming out of, the doctor's office after, where Jenna and Balto were coming out of the doctor's office after finding out about Rosie being sick. And Steele finds them in the boiler room, and he has this string of sausages that he stole out of the meat locker or whatever. And he tries to flirt with Jenna by wrapping the meat around her neck, which is oh yeah, that's really sexy there, Boris, or not Boris, Steele. That's really sexy. Yep, very sexy. But Jenna ends up tricking him and making him put his butt on the boiler and burning it. Unfortunately, Balto, because of Steele flaming him, gets blamed for the sausages being stolen, and all of that stuff is unfortunately what ends up happening there. So it's just Steele continuously just causes more and more problems for Balto, just like here. He, makes it so Balto is not picked for the team. And then the team departs that night to head to Nenana to get the medicine. And they head off, getting all, they get the message that, they got to Nenana and got the antitoxin, and that they're on their way back. And unfortunately, while they are on their way back, they end up getting lost. And there's various checkpoints throughout the area that they're supposed to be able to check in to make sure that they're on the right track, and so that way they can send information back to Nome and Anchorage and other places, so that way they know what's going on. Unfortunately, they miss two of the checkpoints, and what ends up happening is this means that they are now off the trail and very lost. Now, to Steele and his team's credit, they managed to get all the way from Nenana from Nome to Nenana, which is I think 300 miles or something like that. Is a good chunk of a distance. I don't remember if it was 300 miles one way and then it's 300 miles back for 600 miles total. I don't remember. But it's those really large amounts of numbers, because Alaska is effing enormous. And back then, 100 years ago, it probably seemed even bigger. Without cars and trucks and stuff like that to be able to get around easier. And better planes. And things like that. So Steele and his team did very well for like the distance that they covered, but unfortunately they end up getting lost because they end up getting disorientated in the giant storm, and then they end up stranded at the base of this slope. Their musher gets knocked out and is unconscious during this time frame. To be fair, this guy probably should have died from like hypothermia during this time frame, but thankfully he doesn't. And of course, Balto, along with all the other dogs, find out that, you know, well, because it's all the dogs are like together and they're talking, finding out that, oh, the team's off the course, and what are we going to do now? And Balto is, you know, he's like listening in on this conversation because he's not part of the conversation because he's an outcast. And he's like walking around in this scene. There's the bit of a scene that happens here where he looks in at the carpenter who made Rosie's sled in the beginning of the movie, and now he's having to make coffins for children, which is, nobody likes making coffins, but specifically coffins for children is not something that any carpenter ever wants to have to make. And like, you can even tell that this guy does not want to be doing this, but he has to be ready in case this doesn't work. And it's looking more and more hopeless for the citizens of Nome. And, you know, all the children are getting worse, Rosie is getting worse, all this stuff. And like, Jenna is just like watching through the window as this is going on. And Balto has decided that he is going to go and find the team and try to bring back the medicine. So he starts, you know, he's getting ready to go off. Boris is going after him and trying to be like, why are you doing this? And Muck and Luck are also following them. And Balto actually, like, because Boris is just like, you're going to try to save a town that hates you for reasons that are unknown. And it's just like, Balto's not doing this to be a hero. Balto is doing this because it's the right thing to do, and because it's something that he wants to try to do to help. That's the reason Balto is doing this. It's not out of arrogance or out of pride or anything like that. He's doing it because he wants to help these children. He wants to help Rosie. Not just to impress Jenna. I mean, that's a side effect of it, but he's doing it because it's the right thing to do, and he at least wants to try to do his best to help in this situation. And we have the scene where like Balto goes to the window of the hospital, and like Boris is like following him and like looking in the window, and he sees all the sick kids and Rosie and everything, and like you just see this, like Boris's face just goes from like, okay, let's go. Like, just this resignation on Boris's face of like, okay, yeah, no, I don't want to watch these kids die either, basically. So Balto, Boris, Muck and Luck all head out, following the trail that they're trying to get, you know, following the trail that the team would have taken to try to get to Nana in the first place, and watching for any clues. And Balto is like marking the trail as they go along, you know, with his scent, with like claw marks on the trees and stuff like that, so that way it's easier for them to find their way back. While they're on this journey, unfortunately they run into a giant F-off grizzly bear that attacks them. Thankfully, Jenna shows up, and between her and Balto, they're able to kind of get it away from them, and Balto kind of, not intentionally, but leads it onto this like frozen lake, where, because like Jenna had like started to follow them because she like found their scent at the hospital and then like followed it to catch up with them, because she's like, okay, what's Balto doing? Although I love the fact that this implies that just like all the dogs that live in Nome, like, they're kind of just allowed to run around wherever the heck they want. I'm like, for like Siberian, for like these huskies and stuff like that, for the sled dogs and different things like that, and other dogs, that like being purebred is very important in this setup. That doesn't seem very, very logical, to just let your dogs roam around, particularly your female dogs just roam around. Something could happen. I mean, it doesn't. This is an animated kids movie. They're not necessarily going to do that, but just with the logic of like, okay, that doesn't quite work, but whatever. And so, you know, they fight the grizzly bear, and then they end up on this frozen lake with Balto and the bear ends up falling through the ice, which makes these giant cracks, which means that Balto ends up falling through the ice and is drowning. Muck and Luck dive into the water and end up finding Balto and end up being able to get him out of there safely. Which is like, they have this moment where it's just like, oh my god, we were swimming. We were in the water, we were moving, oh my god, we were swimming type of a thing. Where it's like them realizing that they can swim. So that kind of, helps with that. And like Jen is really happy to see Balto, and like she's trying to, help warm him up after like nearly freezing to death in the water. And unfortunately, Jenna got injured during the fight with the grizzly bear. To be fair, I'm pretty sure Balto got injured too, because he got thrown into a couple of different things that were not good. But, like trees and rocks and stuff like that. Balto goes through a lot of abuse through this movie, a lot of physical abuse throughout this movie. Emotional and mental abuse too, given the way that he's treated by everybody else, but physical abuse also. And what ends up happening is, Balto's like, well, Jenna can't continue, she's injured. And so he has Muck and Luck carry her back to Nome on like this branch, so that way she doesn't have to walk on her injured leg. And he tells Boris, and you're gonna have to lead them back because you know them, they're gonna get distracted. And Boris is kind of like, fine, I'll do that, because he knows it's the right thing to do. And Boris looks at Balto and he gives him this very good advice. It's like, this is not a journey that a dog could not make alone, but maybe a wolf can. Because all throughout the movie and all throughout his life, Balto has been trying to like hide his wolf heritage as best he can, which he can't really do that because he looks like a wolf. But, and he's got bigger paws than other dogs and bigger claws and different things like that. He's, designed a bit differently. He's built a bit differently in this regard than the sled dogs. And so we get a lot of that with, Balto, not using his wolf senses and everything else like that to the best of his ability. And Boris is like, a dog's not going to be able to do this on your own, but maybe a wolf can. And like he heads off with Jenna and Muck and Luck to take her back to Nome, so she can, heal up. And Balto keeps going on his own. Thankfully, during this time frame, and he does end up finding where Steele and his, and the rest of the team are. And they, Balto gets to, where they are. He finds them because there's like this lantern that's like tied to the box that has all of the serum in it, the antitoxin and everything in it, that's like very well tied down to the sled. So Balto's like able to find them, and he like explains to them like, how would you get us back? And he's like, well, I marked the trail. And they're like, okay, well, that's reasonable. And from there, what ends up happening is, Steele is just, Balto's like checking in to find out what happened. And they're like, well, our musher fell and hit his head and he hasn't gotten up yet. And they're like, well, we don't know what else to do. And like Steele, at that point in time, like all the dogs had just been like laying down there or whatever, just like waiting for the past however many hours, whatever, since they landed there, since they crashed there. And this just leads into like, okay, they're all frozen, they're all hungry and thirsty. I mean, technically there's snow, so they could eat the snow, and that would give them at least water, so they're not, dehydrated necessarily. But they're definitely all hungry, because they don't know how good they would be at hunting. But what ends up happening, unfortunately, is, Steele refuses to let Balto either lead the team or be like a help to the team or whatever. Also refuses to let Balto take the serum. So just they end up fighting. And like Balto tries to not fight. Balto's not fighting back against Steele. He's, just trying to be peaceful in this regard. Unfortunately, this ends up resulting in Steele. Earlier on, Jenna had given Balto her bandana to kind of semi-help keep him warm, and like Steele grabs the bandana and ends up falling off the cliff. Who, to be fair, given the distance that he falls, should probably, at the very least, not have several broken bones, be dead, given how far he falls, dog or not. So Balto takes charge of the team, and they, start heading off. And, this is like kind of the first times where we're seeing some of the respect for Balto from the other dogs. And they start going. Unfortunately, they find out that Steele, who managed to get ahead of them, has sabotaged the trail by just like marking up all of the trees way too much, so it's harder for Balto to be able to figure out which route they have to take. So they end up going in circles and everything. And this leads to, unfortunately, Balto and the medicine end up kind of falling off of a cliff. And we cut back to Nome, where Jenna is explaining to the rest of the dogs like what Balto is up to. And this is when Steele shows up. Again, he got back there way too fast. To be fair, he's one dog, not, 8 of them in a sled, but still. He got back to Nome and is like made up this whole BS story about like they kept falling one by one and I tried carrying them on the sled and on my back, and then Balto showed up and the medicine fell and so did he, and oh, I'm so sorry, Jenna. And he like gives her back the bandana, and Jenna's like, okay, you're BSing us. You are lying out of your teeth. You're lying through your teeth. And she heads off. The rest of the dogs are, of course, all believing Steele, because why wouldn't they? And what ends up happening is, of course, we cut back to where Balto is. Or we have this nice little sequence here, actually, where Jenna has like made her way out of like to like the outskirts of the city by like one of like the snowbanks, and she somehow has gathered up a bunch of broken bottles. How she did this while injured and not getting cut is a complete mystery. And she has a lantern that is lit. Again, where she got this lantern, I don't know. And she uses that to make like the same trick that Balto showed her earlier, to make the lights appear on the snowbank, so that way it's like this light in the snowstorm, for Balto and the others to be able to follow should they get close enough to Nome that they'll be able to see it. So she does that, and then we cut back to where Balto is like digging himself out of the snow where he fell down the cliff. Thankfully, the container, the box with the serum in it is fine. This box goes through a lot of abuse, by the way. How all of that antitoxin is not broken, I do not know. But what ends up happening is Balto has this vision where he sees this white wolf, this large, beautiful white wolf, who is supposed to be like this representation of like his mother. Because I think later on in one of the sequels, I haven't quite decided if I'm going to talk about the sequels. I enjoy the sequels, but we'll see what happens. This white wolf is supposed to be a representation of like Balto's mother. And also this representation of like his inner instincts as a wolf that he's kind of been like denying for the majority of his life. And Balto hears Boris's voice of like, a dog cannot do this on their own, but maybe a wolf can, and that gives Balto this determination. And he starts using his instincts better, his wolf instincts, part wolf instincts, his heritage so much better too. It's just like, instead of viewing it as a weakness, he's going to view it as a strength and use that. And he like is able to drag the medicine with the lantern on it, because it's still covered in ropes, drag it up the cliff and back up to the team, where they get it all settled back on the sled and everything, and have like the owner, the mushers on the sled all tied down. How the dogs tied down the owner, I have no idea, but they do that. And now that Balto is focusing more, he's using his senses to be able to filter out all of the false markers that Steele left, because he's able to recognize his own sense and everything much better now. It's just like tune out Steele's interference. So they make their way through. They get past this ice bridge that kind of falls apart. There is an avalanche that makes them run into this ice cavern. where they're, they manage to get through the ice cavern as it like is like collapsing in around them, with all the ice stalactites on the ceiling falling around them as they manage to get out. um and like we cut back to Nome, and just like Jenna is like, there's this scene where like Rosie's parents had like asked the doctor to let them let Jenna into the hospital, and they did. And Rosie is trying to, Rosie's not doing any better. Jenna's just like laying there waiting for Rosie, praying that Rosie gets better. And we see, Steele is just like making up all of these different stories and everything else like that to, to all the other dogs that are there. And just like the town is running out of hope, and like so that's very much shown that way. And we see Boris and Muck and Luck, and they're just like sitting there on the boat, just like missing Balto and everything. And then they hear this howl in the background, and Boris recognizes it as Balto's howl. And like, Balto's howling far enough away, because like wolf cries can be heard quite a distance away, so that's like getting all of the attention of like Boris and the bears, and like Jenna in the hospital is hearing it. And like that's like waking up the town, because like now all the dogs are waking up because they're hearing Balto and all the other dogs. And like they get to town, and like Balto sees like the fake aurora borealis that Jenna made for him, and he knows that it was for him, that Jenna is the one that did it to lead them back. And they ride into town, or they run into town with the sleigh and the antitoxin and everything, and everybody's like, oh my god, they did it. And they realize that it's Balto that's at the head of the team and not Steele, that Balto went out and he helped them. And they get the antitoxin into the hospital and start getting it to all of the kids. And all of the dogs that were like around Steele, just like listening, hanging on his every word, realize that, oh my god, Jenna was right, Steele was lying about this. And like they just abandon him and go out, and like the town is just like celebrating this, and like finally like embracing Balto the way that he kind of always wanted to be. But he's just also very, kind of unnerved a little bit by this, because it's a very new thing. Also, like, Boris runs in and hugs him. It's like, okay, the goose shows up, that's not surprising. The two polar bears that are now running into your town and hugging the dog would be one of those things where it's just like, okay, why are the polar bears here? Where did they come from? That's not normal. Type of a thing is like what happens there. But so we have it that all the kids are getting better, and like Balto gets brought into Rosie's father brings Balto into the hospital, so he can see Rosie, and like so she can thank him for helping save her and everything. And then him and Jenna, we see them, and they're now together. They're supposed to be like a couple at this point in time, and Rosie's getting better, and she's like, thank you Balto, I would have been lost without you, type of thing. And that's kind of how like the animated portion of the movie ends. And then we cut back to New York and Central Park, where we now have the older elderly woman and her granddaughter have now shown up, and they found their way to the statue of Balto that is in Central Park. This is a real statue that is there, with the memorial about it written on it, for like for the sled dogs who ran the distance between Nenana and Nome to deliver the antitoxin in 1925. And then like the grandma explains that and every year now they run the Iditarod race along this same trail, which is true. And almost every year they run this race, weather permitting. I think it happened, I don't remember what time of year it happens, but that's like this famous sled dog race and everything. And what ends up happening is the little girl is like, do you think that we could train Blaze, who is like their little husky puppy that they have, train him to race? And the grandma's like, maybe, with a lot of practice. And the little girl runs off to try to start, getting Blaze to mush and everything. Cute puppy, by the way. And what ends up happening is the grandma, who's Rosie, who's revealed to be a grown-up Rosie, is, looks up at the statue and is just like, thank you, Balto. I would have been lost without you. And she then walks off to go join her granddaughter and the husky puppy. And, as like the statue stands there, proudly in the sunlight. And that's the end of the movie. We have the end credits song is Reach for the Light by Steve Winwood. Nice song. For the cast, we have Kevin Bacon as Balto, because why the heck not? We have Bob Hoskins as Boris the goose. And Bob Hoskins is, of course, he's the detective in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. He is Shmi in Hook, the Robin Williams Peter Pan movie. He's been in so many other movies. I love Bob Hoskins. Rest in peace. Bridget Fonda is Jenna. Jim Cummings, who has been so many different roles in so many different animated movies, is Steele. And Phil Collins is Muck and Luck, the polar bears. I love the fact that Phil Collins, who is just known for being this singer, is like, oh yeah, I'll come in and play these two animated polar bears. That's fine. And he does a great job at it. And then for the grown-up version of Rosie, we have Miriam Margolyes, who is actually, I know her best as Professor Sprout from the Harry Potter franchise from the movies. Is like the best thing that I know her from. I know she's been in lots of other movies, but that's the main thing that I know her from is that. So, small bit here for the historical differences and inaccuracies and stuff like that happened in the movie. First of all, Balto in reality was not a wolf dog. He was a purebred black and white Siberian Husky. And there's like pictures of him, so he's not a wolf dog at all. That's just something that they made up for the movie, which I'm kind of okay with. It's an underdog story in the movie, literally an underdog story throughout the course of the movie. And then in reality, he wasn't really that. There is actually the taxidermied body of Balto that is at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, so you could go and see that. He was never an outcast or a street dog or anything like that. He was this purebred dog that was part of the racing circuit and everything else like that as a sled dog. And, there's other various inaccuracies. The Steele character is just a completely made up character for the most part. There's various other little miniature inaccuracies. The other main kind of inaccuracy that kind of happens is, some of the infected were also adults, not just the children. Some of it were adults that were infected as well, unfortunately. Because diphtheria is just something that is like, it can be very easily spread in that regard. None of the mushers were unconscious at any point in time. Nothing like that. In the movie, Balto and Jenna become mates and they have puppies in the other movies. Unfortunately, in reality, Balto was already neutered, so he never fathered any dogs. So it's not like you could have a dog that you can trace their lineage back to like Balto or anything like that. And the other thing is that throughout the course of the actual sled dog run from Nanana to Nome and such, the other dog that did a good chunk of the majority of the running, his name was Togo. And he unfortunately kind of gets pushed to the side since Balto and his team are the ones that made like the last run, the last section of the run. They're the ones that get the majority of the credit. But Togo and his team ran far more of the run than Balto did. So that's kind of like where like the Steele character comes in. But they were all doing it because they wanted to get the kids better, all the people that were sick in Nanana and Nome better, not out of glory. But unfortunately, Togo got kind of pushed to the side. That does get remedied a little bit. Togo got a live action version of his story on Disney Plus, and I think it was 2019 is when it came out. It has like Willem Dafoe as like the sled dog musher, as Togo's owner. And I don't know if they have like Balto as a character in the movie or not. I personally have not watched that movie, although I may end up watching it just to say that I have and be like, this one might be a bit more historically accurate. Although there's still like some inaccuracies, obviously, as happens with like almost any movie, there are historical inaccuracies um, that happen even when based on true stories. But that's just, as I said, these differences here aren't nearly as grievous as kind of the differences that we see in like Pocahontas versus real life versus the Disney movies. So I'm a little more willing to let some of them slide since it bases itself a little bit more in some of the reality type of a thing, and it's not as has grievous inaccuracies. But you could they still run the sled dog race. All these Balto was a real character. There may not have been an actual Rosie, but there were lots of other children who were in Nome and who were very sick and dying had the antitoxin not gotten there. And yes, the Iditarod sled race is still run every year, almost every year, weather permitting. I think during COVID there may have been some of it where it was like postponed simply because of COVID, although this is the sled runners probably still could have run or still could have done that portion of it, but then like all of the watchers wouldn't have been there. But that's what I have here for Balto. I do love Balto. It's another one done by Amblin Entertainment, so it's Steven Spielberg is part of the production of it and everything. I very much enjoy this movie. I just find it a fun movie to watch. As I said, I have not 100% decided if I'm going to do the two sequels, Balto, Wolf Quest, and then Wings of Change are the two sequels. I might do the sequels because I like them, but I just haven't decided that yet at the moment. We'll see what else happens. So that's what I have here. I thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day. Bye!